sometime in the last week, maybe 4 days ago, 5 days ago, I was standing at the counter and I was just thinking stuff. And while I was thinking about certain things, another little thought seemed to be like a little cloud floating about a foot or two above my head. That if I felt like if I reached up and I grabbed, if I was able to capture this little cloud going by, that it was another thought. It wasn't a specific thought. I didn't have a specific worded thought in my head going, you know what I think about this or that. But it was like, oh wait, there's a thought there. There's something from my past that if I could just reach up and grab it, and then maybe I could. And I never got to the point of actually figuring out what the thought was. Just sort of like you have a faint whiff of a fragrance, and you think, oh, wow, I know that reminds me of something, but I can't think what. And so I was left without even a thought to try to remember what I was thinking on that topic or subject. It was just a memory of the general nature of the thought itself. And that left me for several days just trying to think, I wonder if that'll come back to me if I can keep thinking about it. And I think I finally did. Finally pretty much remembered what the thought was. So the thought was, I think, a memory of how 30 years ago I had a notion of having to create your own society. Instead of relying on, well, here's the music industry, the record companies, here's the newspaper companies and the television companies, and so I should just go through this whole process of I should audition for some record companies and get a band together, and then the band goes and has an audition with the record company, and hopefully they give us a contract, and then we spend the next 7 years fulfilling that contract by making records, and they promote us, and then we get interviewed by the newspapers and radio and television, and we go. I was thinking, well, suppose you just make your own structure instead of depending on the structure that exists. Go and make your own. Start your own instead of waiting for music magazines to interview you, for instance. And the Rolling Stone magazine, for instance. Waiting to get on the cover of the Rolling Stone. Why don't you start your own music magazine? So that's sort of very much similar to the idea of Apple, of the Beatles decided, well, why don't we create our own company? Why don't we create our own music? And Apple could have succeeded if they hadn't tried to do it in a sort of a hippie-ish manner, a little bit too much. The Beatles could have created Apple and could have created Apple, the Apple music industry or whatever corporation could have succeeded to a point where today, 40 years later, they're the established name. That Apple is the big company that people depend on. The same, similar to the way Walt Disney Studios. I mean, Walt Disney Studios became successful. Didn't have to. Walt Disney didn't have to create his own studios. Well, in a sense, he did, but it wasn't foreordained that the Walt Disney Studios were going to necessarily become something that existed at all. Walt Disney could have spent his whole life saying, well, I'm just going to go around to the existing film studios and beg them for a job, and that's what we do. We go around to job interviews all the time and say, no, please hire me so I can be your fucking slave until my retirement or until you sack me before that even happens. And certain people say, fuck this, I'm going to go and become my own boss. I'm going to go create my own company. And that was a sort of a thought that I had 35 years ago when I was much younger and less emotionally exhausted by the whole thing. And then, okay, so yeah, the Apple Corporation tried to operate on certain, just tried to be so different that they weren't, that the whole economic principles, financial principles of the thing weren't going to apply. And what happened was they got taken advantage of by all the rip-off artists, and that fell apart. So anyhow, I think that's basically the thought that was a little cloud floating over my head last week, or number of days ago, earlier this week. And it seemed, and I guess the reason that was floating over my head was it was sort of the same notion was going through my mind recently. It's like, well, if the fucking internet sucks, why don't you create your own internet? And that doesn't mean that the internet entirely sucks, any more than the Beatles were saying that the music industry entirely sucks. But there's certain aspects of it that do suck. And there's certain aspects of the internet that do suck. And it would be a worthwhile goal to try to imagine your own alternate type of an internet. So that's what it was. I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna say that that's probably what that little thought cloud was floating beyond my reach. And what I had forgotten about, and what it was, that thought cloud was probably reminding me of, was 30 years ago I tried to do it. 30 years ago I said, I'm going to go and create my own newspaper. It's going to be different. It's not going to be this bullshit news. It's going to be my own real news. Anybody doesn't like it, they don't have to read it. But I'm going to put out. And I made one edition. And I tried to sell it for 10 cents on the fucking Boston Common. And in fact, I think yeah, so anyhow, the policeman didn't allow me to sell it for 10 cents because they said I didn't have a vending license. So I couldn't sell it for 10 cents. But meanwhile, there was a guy in a chicken suit handing out free newspapers for some other organization. And they didn't hassle him at all. There he was standing in a chicken suit handing out these free things. And they said, well, that's for free. So I went back again and I said, well, then I can give it out. I can hand these out for free then. So I went and I said I was going to hand them out for free, and the policeman came up and they practically killed me at that point. This woman came on this very large horse. I mean, I finally learned the meaning of the expression, get off your high horse. That was such a high horse. This woman was on it, looking way down on me, and she was ready to trample me with that horse. That woman, that crazy policewoman, was ready to trample me with that horse. She was circling around me. Crazy bitch. So that pretty well, for that moment, that shut me down there. And at that point I started thinking, well, what I have to do then is, if I'm going to sell my newspaper, is get these vending machine boxes on the streets to sell the newspaper in. And I started researching that. I started going to City Hall and saying, well, do you need a license for that, etc., etc. And I started to learn about the bureaucracy, about what happens when you have to go to City Hall and go to the government and ask them for information about what's the red tape to do this and to do that, and then they put you through red tape just to find out about the red tape, and they do bullshit to you. One guy, I went there, and one guy at the office. This is like the state official department agency office that dealt with I don't know exactly what department I went to, but I remember going in that building, and I asked the guy some questions about what's the requirements for selling, like if you're selling newspapers on the streets, do you have to have a license and permits or anything like that, and what's this and that. And so one of these people that came to the window as the person to help the public with their questions gave me certain answers, and then I went back again with some other question about it, and a different guy came to the window. I remember excuse me for remembering it, but I remember he was a big black guy. He came to the window to say, "Can I help you?" And I tried to tell him, well, when I was here before, the person told me this and that. And he said, well, do you know the person's name? No, I didn't know the person. I didn't get the person's name, but he worked here. Oh, well, if you don't know his name, I can't verify that he said this. I can't vouch for the information he gave you. You'd have to remember his name. You'd have to get his badge number or something. Just basically, you'd have to know. That's what fucking bullshit. And he was doing this with a smirk on his face, this fucking guy. He was just deliberately trying to give me a runaround and not help me out with the questions I had. As if they come up to you and say, hello, my name is such and such. Can I help you? And if you have any further questions, please remember my name, so that in the future, when you come to this window, and have any further questions, you must specify that you've been talking to me and try to ask for me, or if not, say, oh, I was talking to so and so, to Mr. Smith, to Mr. John Smith. I was talking to last time that I was here, Mr. Smith, Agent 746. And he told me such and such. Oh, well, Mr. Smith, I'll refer you to that. But instead, I go to the window, and I haven't noted the guy's name that came to the window the last time, and I say, and I have a question. Oh, do you remember his name? Well, fuck you, fucking fuckers. These fucking people that get hired by the fucking government to stand there with the smirks on their face and give you the bureaucratic runaround. So anyhow, at that time, I guess that's the thought that was vaguely coming back to me from the past. And earlier this week I just put this out of my mind after decades of this. I had put this whole notion out of my mind of starting my own newspaper. I'd forgotten about it even, and that was the idea that I had to try to start your own system, so you don't have to go begging. That's what the Beatles said. We're starting Apple Corporation, so that people who want to be musicians in the future won't have to go begging to these big record companies, probably yours. What he was saying to the people holding the interview, and he was right in saying that, probably yours. The same people that were conducting this news media interview with the Beatles about their opening Apple corporations were probably part of the same companies that did own the record companies, the music business record companies, and the Beatles were trying to create an alternative to. So I eventually ended up putting off having to just say, well, right now I just have to try to get a regular job and make some money, because I can't even afford to try to put out a newspaper at this point. I had no money, and I think that's what was occurring to me earlier this week was, my gosh, here's this money now that's available to me for the moment, and these thoughts about, well, what are you going to do with this money now? And there it is, floating a foot or two away from my brain, is this thought. And do you remember 30 years ago when you wanted to start a newspaper and you had no money? And if you had this kind of money then to have tried to start a paper, how different might things have turned out by now? And I'm going to go with that and say I'm satisfied that that's the answer to the question of what was that thought that I hadn't even put into words earlier this week. I just felt the thought floating over my head. I didn't even put it into, not only putting it into words, I didn't even put it into the form. I just felt it like a whiff of a memory, but didn't have the actual, what was that memory? which is different from saying, okay, well, I have this thought, but I didn't put it into words. And I remember the thought was about newspaper, but I didn't put the thought into words. It wasn't even there. It was just, I felt at the time, I have this thought, and what was that thought about? And if I had been able to stop and capture that thought, I would think, oh yes, it was about that old idea of starting my own newspaper. But I didn't even get that far this week. I just had, oh, there was a thought about something this is reminding me of. I don't remember exactly what it was. And I'm thinking now that I think this is what that thought that I was being reminded of was. The thought of once upon a time I tried to start a newspaper. And I'm thinking that along the same lines now. I'm thinking now, 30 years later, starting a newspaper isn't really that much of a goal. I mean, 30 years ago, that's what there was. There was newspapers and there was radio and television, but there wasn't internet. So if you want to write, they didn't have bloggers. And if you wanted to write a blog that the public had access to, you'd have to write for a newspaper or a magazine. They had newspapers, they had magazines, but they didn't have internet blogs, or they had books. If you could publish a book or write for a newspaper or write for a magazine, that's what there was existence then. Now the internet has overshadowed or over whatever the over word is, overtaken. The internet has overtaken the books, the magazines, and the newspapers, and now everybody writes for the fucking internet. Now everybody broadcasts themselves, and to do so doesn't make you stand out. But 30 years ago, if you started your own little newspaper, no matter how few people read it, even if you only had a few dozen readers, that puts you a few dozen people of an audience ahead of the vast majority of the population. Now you have a few dozen readers on the internet and you're still nothing. You might as well be writing on a bathroom wall. So that was the idea. So the idea net, to create your own alternate media system, whether it's writing your own books, putting out your own magazine, or putting out your own newspaper, having your own radio station. All these things are now possible on the internet. Only it's the potential, the powerfulness of it is diluted by the fact that everybody has access to the same tools, and you're still in competition with all the girls dancing in their underwear. Basically, that's your competition. Girls dancing in their underwear, people posting videos of their babies and their puppies. And the question is, how can we really create our own society, I guess, is the real question. Can we really create our own society instead of having to spend forever and ever sucking up to the same people with power and money who run things? And there's all the people in this world, in the society, who are just fine with the way things are just fine with having these companies run everything. They're just fine with having these super billionaires running for president, running for office, political office, and they vote for them. And it just gives me a headache to even think about it. When I think about high school, and there were a certain number of people in high school that I really despised. They were really disgusting people, and they were always arrogant. You'd walk by, and because your hair was a little longer and they didn't know you, they'd call you faggot. And if you turned around when you heard somebody saying faggot, you'd walk by, out of the lunchroom in high school, out of the cafeteria, if you walk out the door, there was this wall where all these kids used to hang out and smoke cigarettes, I think. And they just kids hanging out every day. Kids I didn't know, kids I had no interest in knowing. They had no particular interest in anything that I had interest in. They weren't interested in, I mean, they weren't the kids that played in the band. I'm not talking about a rock band. I'm talking about the concert band where I played the tuba. And I was interested in music, and I was interested in being in the theater productions. And these kids were kids who had absolutely, I had no contact with them. There was no common interest. They might have, some of them had something to do with sports, others of them, most of them didn't. They were just sitting there smoking every day and sneering at people that they didn't know who would walk by and didn't dress the way they dressed. And so if my hair was a little longer than theirs, because they were basically the kids we would have called greasers 10 years earlier anyhow, and still would have kind of called them still would have, in 1977, would still vaguely have gone by the name of greasers. We thought of it as Greaser's Corner. They weren't necessarily kids who wore grease anymore, although they were older brothers and sisters, or their older brothers, or even their parents 20 years earlier in the 1950s and early 60s would have put this grease material in their hair to slick it down, and you'd see them the movie Grease. There it is, just like the people in the movie Grease, and they'd slick in their hair in the 50s and early 60s, and those people were called greasers. And that's why this movie Grease came out. It was like, Grease? I want to watch a movie about a bunch of, it came out as a musical first, in like around 1975. I want to watch a musical about a bunch of fucking greasers? You know, the greasers were the people that wouldn't get involved in theater productions, in musicals. And so here's a musical being acted and sung in by the theatrical people that the greasers would typically have been putting down and calling faggots, and yet here's the theatrical, artistic, musical people putting on a fucking musical about the fucking greasers. This, to me, was pretty ridiculous. I was like, why but it was meant in order to, it was kind of, the whole thing was intended to try to reach the non-theater audience, I believe. Is, we're going to make a musical that the greasers will like. The people that used to call us faggots will make a musical about them, so to bring them in. I really believe there's something, whether it was explicit in the mind of the people that wrote that story, Grease, or more subtle, even to themselves, that they weren't even consciously aware this was what they were doing. I think this is to agree with what they were doing when they decided to create a musical called Grease, about these fucking greasers. So, right about that time, 76, 77, when I was in high school, that was still a term that we would have applied to those kinds of kids who would have had no artistic interests, no interest in the theater or music in school, other than rock and roll, man. And I would walk by this, so we thought of them still as greasers. And I'd walk by this, I think it was called Greaser's Corner, as you walked out the cafeteria. And I remember walking out that door, and some kid that I would have thought of more or less as one of these cigarette-smoking greaser types walked by and said, "Sex and drugs and rock and roll." And of course I hadn't heard of whatever, I guess it was the Sex Pistols, or was it the Clash? I don't know who that group that said sex and drugs and rock and roll was. I hadn't heard that song. My first encounter with this phrase was from hearing this kid walking through the courtyard saying sex and drugs and rock and roll. And it just seemed pretty stupid to me. It seemed like I felt walking by this guy. Yeah, this guy's walking around shouting about the things that I have no respect for at all. I had no respect for people taking drugs. I thought that was the stupidest thing in the world. And people talking I wasn't, I tried to be a decent person, and going around advocating Oh, that's a whole other story, yes. But going around advocating sex was not the sort of person that I was interested in being. And if rock and roll was connected with these sorts of things, didn't surprise me at all. That wasn't the sort of music that I felt was really most worthwhile. And excuse me if that bothers anybody to hear me say it. But it's kind of central to the fact of how my life developed afterwards. When after high school I started to think, well, maybe I missed out on something. Maybe I was a little bit too judgmental, and there's something of value in this rock and roll. So why don't I just take a little time to look into it and see what there might be. And then and in that sense, I kind of got my whole kind of path of my musical ambitions got altered after that point, and I'm not sure I'm really that much better off for it. I'm not sure I didn't lose more than I gained, but I felt the need to do that. I felt the need to try to understand and relate to a whole mentality that I had nothing in common with in high school, and I think that's sort of similar to the people writing this musical Grease. We're thinking, oh well, maybe we were too hasty in our judgment of the greaser types. Maybe there's something to their existence that's worth basing a musical on. So these greasers, I would walk by this, I think we call Greaser's Corner, and they'd say faggot. And so if you turn around when you hear somebody saying faggot, I didn't know who said it as I walked by. I don't know any of these people anyhow. I don't recognize their voices. I just hear someone's faggot. And maybe they weren't saying it to me, but they managed to time it every time I walked out the door, so I'd hear them saying. And then I quickly learned that, well, if you turn around when you hear that, then their bitches start giggling and they start sneering at you. Say, hey, what you looking at, faggot? And so it gets to be that it was this game, whereas if you turn around, it shows that you are a faggot. So then you end up having to just not turn around. So then you just walk by and hear it, and you're just supposed to walk on and accept that these people are assholes, and that's their problem and not your problem. These are the sort of thoughts I used to have to think as I walked through the courtyard in high school. It's their problem. It's not my problem. I don't know these people. I don't want to know these people. What they say, what they think isn't my concern. I have my own life to live. Don't even turn around. So you don't even know which of these, it becomes all anonymous. You never know which of these dozen or so jerks were actually the ones trying to insult you as you walked by. And you're never going to find out. And even if you did, even if you knew who it was and you tried to confront them, first of all, you're outnumbered. There's a dozen of them, and etc. So the point is all these asshole people continue to be the same asshole people, and you encounter them. So now 35 years later, these same people that you wanted nothing to do with in high school, you find yourself again in contact, in dialogue with them on the internet. And you're still encountering the same fucking asshole mentality that they had as 17-year-old punks. I don't mean punk as the musical term. I mean punk as just delinquent jerks that you had nothing in common with, common interests in high school. And those people, or their children now, 35 years later, their children are now on the internet, and you're encountering them, and you're engaging in arguments with these same fucking assholes. And I think that somehow too had part of this notion of this thought I had earlier in the week about how once upon a time I had this notion of trying to create something better, trying to create a different mentality than the one that dominates our society, and I didn't. I failed. And so this society is the same society as it was then. And the assholes still run the world like Greaser's Corner, where they stand around sneering and saying nasty things. And some people spend their whole lives, that's their goal, is to be one of the sneering assholes, trying to be as nasty as possible. That's their goal in life, is to be that kind of a person, to be that kind of a creature. And other people's goal in life is to be quite different from that. Other people's goal in life is to create a better society where intelligence is the thing that guides what happens and how we live. So there's this basic difference between those people whose goal in life is guided by the desire for intelligence, and those people whose goals in life are guided by the desire to kick people in the ass, to punch people in the gut, to sneer at people all they can, to say, "You're a faggot, you're a dumbass, you're a faggot, you suck." People whose lives are all based, that's the mental energy that they're involved in. And you can see it. Take a look, for instance, at any of the news articles that are posted with comment sections under them, and every one of them you'll see there's this ongoing conservative versus liberal little war or skirmish going on in the comment section. There's always people who post these comments, "Oh, fucking liberals do this. That's 'cause the fucking liberals this and the liberals that, and fucking fuckers, fuck. Oh, fucking liberals, yeah. Oh, and the media's all run by the fucking liberals. That's because the media's all run by the fucking..." No matter how much the media companies are owned by fucking Dick Cheney and Bushes and all of these Rupert Murdochs and all of these fucking bastards who put themselves up for election as candidates and run this world and run the whole Fox News media and all that promotes this kind of bullshit that our society is sinking